The life of a medieval nun has become a thing of legend. When you hear medieval nuns, you probably imagine angelic women in spotless habits, hands folded in prayer, living lives of saintly devotion. That's the marketing version the church wanted you to believe. But what were medieval nuns actually like? Nunneries in medieval Europe were supposed to be places of piety, education, and safety, often for women whose families couldn't or wouldn't arrange a marriage. For some, it was genuinely a calling. These women chose to dedicate their lives to God and forsook the world. For others, it was a way of life their family chose for them. Many were sent young, sometimes as early as age 12, not because they had a divine calling, but because they were an extra mouth to feed or a convenient way to avoid dowries. Some women did embrace the life sincerely, dedicating themselves to prayer and service, but others? Well, cloister walls couldn't keep out human nature. Communities of women, even those dedicated to God, were still full of human drama. These communities were filled with gossip, political maneuvering, and the occasional outright rebellion against strict rules. We have letters and records of nuns complaining about bad food, broken promises, or the fact that their abbess was pocketing the convent's money. In 1434, the nuns of a German convent wrote a list of complaints against their new abbess. She didn't care about the state of the building, they said, and she kept forcing them to eat stale bread. A nunnery in England in 1321 wrote of their disdain for their new leader. Within weeks of her arrival, the stench from her foul-smelling room drove them nearly crazy. And if that wasn't bad enough, she assigned one of the nuns to be her personal servant. Now, while these are stories of general misconduct, there's another kind of scandal that the church really didn't want you to know about, one that gets to the heart of why the veil of a nun's habit was so important. Because while these communities were meant to be about piety and devotion, they were also a place for some women to escape unwanted or abusive marriages. And sometimes when a nun took the veil, she wasn't leaving one kind of relationship behind only to start another. Medieval nuns weren't necessarily celibate. Forbidden romances were a major scandal for the church. Monasteries and convents depended on donations and support from outside, often from powerful nobles and the clergy, and accusations of immorality could ruin a community's reputation, putting them in danger of losing their funding. So, while we may laugh at the salacious details of who was sleeping with whom today, these scandals were very serious at the time. Most of the time, these stories come to us through the lens of the church and its desire to paint the women who broke their vows as evil and corrupt. There were stories of predatory priests, yes, but also of visiting nobles and, yes, other nuns. There are records of entire communities banding together to break the vows of chastity. Sometimes these relationships were exposed after death, when gossip from graveyards revealed illicit affairs and secret burials. Other times, it was exposed during investigations into a nun's behavior, when jealous rivals accused them of impropriety. It was unusual for a prioress to send a nun suspected of a relationship with a visiting priest out of the convent for a short, cooling-off period. If she returned after that and was still behaving badly, then the relationship must have been pretty serious. The records don't go into detail about these relationships, but we do know that despite the vow of chastity, medieval nuns weren't forbidden from having romantic relationships. The problem, according to the church, was that these relationships were with the wrong people. If you've ever stayed in a hotel or Airbnb, you've probably signed a waiver saying that if you find something scandalous in the room, you'll keep it to yourself. Imagine doing that, but with God as your witness, and you'll get some sense of what these women were up against. But whether the stories are true or false, scandal or reality, we can see that the lives of medieval nuns were far more complicated than the angelic image the church would like us to believe. Hi everyone, I'm the host. And thanks for watching this episode of our series, Medieval Nuns Were More Than Their Habits. Remember, you can find all of our videos ad-free on a streaming platform. When you hear the word nun, what do you think of? A woman in a habit kneeling in prayer, contemplating the mysteries of the divine, perhaps? That's certainly the image many of us have. And sure, there were plenty of women throughout history who joined convents because of deep religious feeling. because they wanted to devote their lives to God. But that wasn't the only reason women joined religious orders. In fact, in many cases, it wasn't even the main one. For many, many centuries, for most of European history really, joining a convent was a pretty practical decision, or at least it was for those who could afford it. See, if you were a noble family, having your daughter marry off was an expensive proposition. Marriages required dowries, a lot of money or goods given to the couple by the bride's family. And you didn't want to cheap out on that because giving a smaller dowry meant your daughter wasn't considered a valuable commodity, and that could bring shame on the family. Plus, you usually wanted your daughter to marry well, that is, to marry someone of equal or higher status. And the higher the status, the higher the dowry expectations. So if you were a noble family and you had a lot of daughters, say 3 or more, you couldn't afford to marry them all off. You just didn't have enough money or land to go around. And that's where convents came in, because in many ways, it was cheaper to send your daughter to live a religious life than to marry her off. In some places, the church required a dowry of a certain value, and that value wasn't all that high. So, for poorer noble families, it might only cost a few thousand florins to buy your daughter's place in a convent, and that was a one-time payment. Marrying her off, on the other hand, could end up costing tens of thousands over the course of her life. Not to mention, when you married your daughter, you had to give up half of her fortune to her husband's family. When you put it that way, the decision to send your daughter to a convent becomes much more appealing, especially considering that convents sometimes offered financial aid to families who couldn't quite afford the fees. But for very poor women, the convent wasn't just an option, it was an obligation. For them, life outside the convent was likely much harsher. They might have been living in extreme poverty or in an abusive household or even just trying to survive childbirth, which statistically was a very dangerous proposition. The convent, on the other hand, offered food, shelter, education, and a certain amount of independence, all things that were extremely rare for women at the time. Of course, that doesn't mean life inside the convent was idyllic. Nuns lived their lives according to a strict schedule, full of prayer, work, and obedience. They also took vows of poverty, chastity, and sometimes even of silence. And they weren't allowed to own any personal property except for the clothes on their back. But while the life of a nun was far from easy, it did offer a measure of freedom and autonomy that many women found appealing. Moreover, these weren't the only benefits that convents had to offer. In some cases, the head of a convent, the abbess, wielded surprising power. Since convents often managed large amounts of money and land, the abbess had to deal with financial matters, legal disputes, even local politics. She and her nuns might negotiate with local nobles for the return of land that had been unjustly seized, as happened in 12th century France. Or they might become embroiled in courtly scandals, as happened to a nun named Christine de Pizan, who got into a massive fight with the king's mistress and ended up getting banned from a monastery. In a few rare cases, nuns even became major political players, like the 16th century Spanish nun, Mariana de Carcova, who successfully negotiated a peace treaty between Spain and Portugal. Yet despite the power some nuns wielded, male clergy often viewed them with suspicion. If they managed property, were involved in politics, and even sometimes ran businesses, then they must surely be too independent, right? Too independent and therefore, in the eyes of the church, too sinful. Many nuns were accused of doing this, of being this, and they suffered greatly as a result. So while the romantic idea of the nun is an appealing one, the reality was more complex. Some nuns truly did choose the religious life. Others had no choice at all. Some were sent to convents by their families to escape poverty or an abusive situation. Still, others had been tricked or coerced into taking holy orders, and not all of them spent their days in silent prayer. Some were educated, politically active, or even wealthy. But whether a nun's story began with free choice or not, once inside the convent, their lives were rarely their own. When you hear the word nun, you might think of someone who has dedicated her life to God, chastity, and silence. But life inside a medieval nunnery wasn't always so quiet. Romantic scandals involving nuns were not just the stuff of legend. They're in the court records, and some of them are downright hilarious. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be exploring what went on when the ladies of the convent got a little too frisky. Now, this is a spicy topic, and it wouldn't be right if I didn't warn you. Things are about to get hot, hot, hot. In 1348, a nun named Joan ran off with her lover, possibly after murdering her abbess. They were spotted leaving a church together, and the pair was soon tracked down. The sheriff dragged them back to the convent, but Joan escaped again. Clearly, she had zero interest in "till death do you part with God," but she was really into "till death do us part" with her boy toy. When the sheriff finally nabbed her, he put her in prison, where she gave birth to his child. Maybe Joan had a thing for men in uniform. Maybe she just wanted a baby. We may never know. This case was recorded by English lawyer and chronicler Robert of Brunn, who had a lot of thoughts about loose women. He also wrote that a man should beat his wife if she committed adultery, but that's neither here nor there. Sometimes romantic entanglements weren't between a nun and a layperson, but between a nun and her priest. These relationships could be pretty intense. Remember, priests were forbidden to marry. So if a priest decided to shack up with a nun, it was a big deal. It was also very risky. If discovered, both the priest and the nun could be punished. The priest risked defrocking and being shunned by his order. The nun risked being expelled from her convent and having to live the rest of her life as a laywoman. Despite the risks, these relationships happened a lot. Priests visited convents for confession or mass, and many of them were young, unmarried men who had never lived outside of a religious house. Nuns, meanwhile, took vows of chastity, but they were still expected to be, well, ladylike. And that meant they could flirt a bit. Medieval people believed that women were naturally more lustful than men, so it was up to the priests to resist temptation. Sometimes, however, they succumbed. Letters from convents sometimes contained passionate language that could only be understood as love letters. And it was unusual for an abbess to demand that a nun accused of improper behavior be investigated. During one investigation in the 1260s, 2 English nuns wrote to Pope Clement IV, begging him to look into the matter. They claimed that another nun had dressed like a man and entered the priest's chamber. What happened next is unknown, but the mere suggestion of such scandalous behavior was enough to shock the faithful. Then there were same-sex relationships, which shocked medieval moralists but were well documented in letters and ecclesiastical investigations. One time, 2 nuns in a French convent were accused of sleeping together. A bishop sent to investigate found the whole thing quite unbelievable. But after questioning the women, he admitted that there was probably something going on. Apparently, the ladies had been exchanging letters with a lot of, quote, intimate expressions. The bishop was able to bring the relationship to a quick end because the nuns were in a double monastery. But even that wasn't enough to save them from scandal. The bishop wrote to the pope asking for advice on how to handle the situation. The 2 nuns had clearly broken their vows, but what should happen next? According to the bishop, one of the nuns had a lot of, quote, wicked and shameful thoughts towards her fellow nuns. Was this story proof that women's minds were naturally more lustful, or was there something else going on? Unfortunately, we don't know the outcome of this particular case. But we do know that the nuns were eventually moved to different monasteries. It's also important to remember that many of these tales were exaggerated by enemies of a particular abbey. Nuns were generally safe from outside interference, but that didn't mean they were completely safe. Rival abbeys would sometimes accuse each other of harboring secret sinners. Even though these stories were likely untrue, they do tell us something about how the church and public viewed nuns as women who could be tempted, despite their vows, and temptation in the medieval mind was never far away. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching. Not all scandals were sexual, some were political. An abbess could control large tracts of land, employ dozens of workers, and even collect taxes. That made her a threat to ambitious local lords. Accusing a convent of moral corruption was a classic medieval power move. If the accusation stuck, the bishop could step in, remove the abbess, and hand over the property to someone more loyal. Sometimes the charges were fabricated from thin air. Other times, real lapses were exaggerated into a full-blown moral collapse. Hi everyone, welcome to this house. Today we are exploring the dark side of nunneries in medieval Europe. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. While some orders were stricter than others, life in a medieval nunnery wasn't all that different from life in a medieval monastery. Nuns followed a religious order, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They prayed, they worked, and they tried to live according to God's laws. But not everyone was cut out for that sort of life. And for those who weren't, a nunnery could be a dangerous place. Rival factions could form inside the walls. Some nuns wanted stricter discipline, others wanted more freedom. When things got bad enough, bishops had to send in mediators. In extreme cases, soldiers. The public expected convents to be peaceful and pious places, but behind the scenes, power struggles could be just as vicious as any medieval town hall meeting. And it wasn't just the neighbors that caused trouble. Religious orders became embroiled in the conflicts raging across Europe. During the 100 Years' War, for example, English and French armies sometimes raided convents. They weren't just looking for food and supplies, they were trying to humiliate their enemy. A band of English soldiers strolling through a French convent was a clear message that they were unsafe anywhere. Even in peacetime, a wealthy convent might find itself targeted by thieves, harassed by local lords, or extorted by traveling nobles. The valuables inside a convent were fair game for anyone who wanted them. That wasn't the only way that a convent could acquire a scandalous reputation. For that, look no further than the royal family. You see, when Mary Tudor came to power in England in 1553, she wasted no time stamping out what she saw as heresy. Hundreds of Protestant clergy and laity were burned at the stake, but she didn't stop there. She turned her attention to the religious orders, especially the nuns. Mary suspected that many convents were havens of heresy, and she sent her agents in to root it out. The nuns were subjected to intense interrogations, and many confessed to a variety of sins, usually under extreme duress. Charges ranged from the mundane to the outlandish, and they often stuck. One nun was accused of stealing communion wafers and selling them to Jews. Another was caught dancing with a soldier in a tavern. And a third was even charged with the heretical crime of serving beer with her supper. These shocking revelations made the rounds in broadside ballads and popular prints, and the public couldn't get enough. Meanwhile, Mary's agents were busy manufacturing new scandals. Nuns were arrested for receiving secret heretical books, conspiring with foreign powers, and even plotting to assassinate the queen. All these accusations were almost certainly false. But that didn't stop Mary from shutting down nearly every convent in the country. As you can probably tell, being a nun in medieval Europe was not always as tranquil as it might seem. Power struggles, theft, religious persecution, wars, and rumors of scandal could make a convent a dangerous place to live and work. But despite the danger, thousands of women entered religious orders and dedicated their lives to the church. Now it's time to hear from you. What do you think? Would you have liked being a nun in medieval Europe? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode of this house. When you picture a medieval nun, what do you see? A stern-faced woman in a wimple, kneeling in prayer and sewing a burial shroud. Maybe she's copying a manuscript by the light of a flickering candle. The image conjures a life of quiet devotion, of endless prayers and somber rituals. But that picture is only half right. Medieval nuns followed a fairly structured routine. They prayed at dawn, did their work during the day, then gathered for more prayers in the evening. But daily life in a convent wasn't just endless chanting and solemn reflection. Medieval nuns led surprisingly full lives. Like the rest of medieval women, nuns were expected to perform domestic tasks. They grew vegetables in convent gardens, brewed beer, baked bread, and even raised pigs. Their work ethic was often praised by contemporary observers, who marveled at the order and cleanliness of a well-run convent. Other duties included copying manuscripts, teaching girls, and producing goods to sell. Some convents specialized in making and marketing a particular product. Benedictine nuns, for instance, were renowned for their expertise in brewing. Others made candles, soap, and cosmetics, which they sold at fairs and markets. These commercial activities not only brought in much-needed income, but also gave the nuns valuable skills and a sense of purpose. A few convents became centers of learning. Monastic libraries could have thousands of texts, rivaling those of some universities. And the sisters weren't just consumers of books. Many convents had scribes who copied manuscripts for use throughout Europe. This work required an incredible amount of skill and precision, and these scribes were highly respected for their ability to reproduce ancient texts exactly. Other convents specialized in health care. They ran infirmaries for the poor and sick, staffed by nuns who had received training in medicine and surgery. These infirmaries weren't just places of healing, they were also centers of community, providing food and lodging to those who had nowhere else to go. This work gave the nuns valuable experience and exposed them to all manner of ailments and injuries. And that work, along with everything else they did, gave nuns a surprising amount of influence. The most important thing to remember about medieval religious orders is that they came in a wide variety. There were dozens of them, each with their own rules and practices. In some orders, like the Cistercians, nuns were expected to be almost totally obedient and rarely spoke except for essential tasks like saying the divine office or asking for permission. In more relaxed convents, conversation, singing, and even music-making were allowed. Some nuns kept pets, bringing cats to deal with vermin or even small dogs for companionship. And in wealthier convents, luxury had a way of creeping in. Fine fabrics, jewelry, and even personal servants weren't unheard of. Now, these comforts sometimes drew criticism from reformers who accused the sisters of forgetting their vows of poverty, but even the strictest orders had to admit that certain luxuries were necessary for the good life. Not all nuns spent their days in mindless drudgery. Medieval nuns were intelligent, creative women who found ways to make their convents homes. They decorated their cells with tapestries and paintings. They wrote poems and illuminated manuscripts. And when the winter snows piled up and work slowed down, they amused themselves with games like chess and cards. But let's be honest, there were also moments of boredom. Letters from nuns complain about endless cold winters, repetitive meals, and abbesses who micromanaged every decision. In other words, office politics existed in the cloister too. Medieval nuns led surprisingly full lives. They worked, they played, they prayed. They also coped with the same problems that all medieval women did: poverty, illness, unwanted pregnancies, and unfaithful husbands. What you see is that medieval nuns weren't just servants of God. They were also human beings trying to make the best of their lives. In the popular imagination, there are few figures more titillating than the sinful nun, a woman who has traded her habit and veil for a life of forbidden pleasures. Stories of sinful nuns became so widespread during the Middle Ages that they even inspired artistic masterpieces like Granuald S. Eisenheim altarpiece, which depicts a nun caught in the throes of lust. But were these tales of convent corruption actually true? Or are they the product of misogyny, religious fervor, and a whole lot of gossip? To answer this question, let's set the scene in 1475 Italy. Religious orders are at the height of their power. Monasteries and convents dot the Italian countryside, each one a microcosm of medieval life. Nuns live, work and pray behind high walls, cloistered from the outside world. But in one convent, life is about to get very complicated. It's the convent of St. Clare, home to around 200 nuns. The building itself is a marvel of medieval architecture, but it's also a hotbed of intrigue. The peace is shattered when accusations surface that several nuns have broken their vows of chastity. Now, rumors of misconduct have circulated around the convent for years, but recently, things have gotten out of hand. Nuns are fighting, food is going missing, and some sisters have even taken to cursing God himself. The local bishop has had enough. He sends an agent to investigate. If the rumors are true, he'll have no choice but to close the convent. Now, we don't know exactly what this agent was expecting to find. But when he arrived at the convent, he was greeted by a group of angry nuns who immediately began hurling abuse at him. They called him a heretic, cursed his family, and accused him of being a secret Protestant. Then they slammed the door in his face. The bishop was furious. He took the nuns' response as a sign of guilt and ordered them to be arrested. One by one, the nuns were dragged from their beds and paraded through the streets. Some were old, some were young, some were virgins, others were mothers. All of them were accused of the same crime, breaking their vows of chastity with men from the local village. But the story doesn't end there. It only gets weirder from this point forward. We don't know the details of what happened next because the records have been lost to history. But later accounts will claim that the bishop subjected the nuns to a series of increasingly absurd trials. At first, they were forced to walk barefoot across hot coals. Those who emerged unscathed were branded with red-hot pokers. Still, none of the nuns confessed to a crime they supposedly didn't commit. So, the bishop had only one option left: exhuming the bodies of 5 recently deceased nuns to check if they were virgins. As you can probably guess, this test yielded nothing conclusive. So the bishop decided to play God and sentence all the nuns to death. According to legend, the nuns were burned alive in a giant oven, along with several priests and monks who had also fallen victim to the sin of lust. To say that this story is bizarre would be an understatement. Even by medieval standards, it's extreme. But that just goes to show how passionate people were about cracking down on perceived immorality. Stories of sinful nuns flourished during the late Middle Ages, especially in regions undergoing religious reform. Protestant leaders like Martin Luther used convent scandals as proof that monastic life had become irreparably corrupt and needed to be abolished. Even in areas where the Reformation didn't take hold, calls for greater oversight of religious orders increased. As a result, many convents were shuttered and their buildings put to other uses. But while some convents were dens of debauchery, many others were places of genuine religious devotion. Life as a medieval nun wasn't easy. They lived in poverty, took vows of obedience, and had almost no personal autonomy. But for many women, it was still a better alternative than the limited options available to them outside the convent. For those who had no prospects for marriage, joining a convent could mean having a home, community, and purpose. Others used the relative safety of a convent as a way to escape difficult circumstances at home. So, were medieval nuns all saints or all sinners? The reality was much more complicated than either of those extremes. Like everyone else, they were simply human beings trying to make the best of a difficult situation. And that's why their stories, messy, dramatic, and sometimes scandalous, continue to fascinate us today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our other videos on medieval monasteries. And thanks to all of our patrons for your continued support.